Most of the time.
All right, we're about to get started. And I believe we got a few online. Well, welcome. Thanks for joining us today, both of you, all of you here at Balboa, as well as those of you who are joining us online. We've got guests from the Bay Area, from Utah, from Central California. So this is exciting stuff. This is a culmination of maybe 2-3 years worth, right? Somewhere around there. For those of you who know, Avery Avina has been a student in the MSkin program since 2019, somewhere around there.
2020 in MSkin.
2020 in MSkin. But because of COVID, you know, like everything else, her research, as well as the research of a few other students, has been delayed. But very excited to hear, excited for you guys to hear the exciting work that she's done. Avery and I have been working together kind of nonstop, if you will, for the last few months, and getting it to a point where it is a robust, established thesis. So I'm very excited for you guys to join us today. So it shouldn't, we've allotted an hour. There is an event that's happening here in this room, I think at noon. So I think should be good to go. The way this works, if you haven't been to a thesis defense, is I'll introduce Avery. She'll go ahead and give her defense presentation. I'll open up the room to questions, both here in the room as well as via Zoom. And then we're going to deliberate. So we'll ask the audience to leave both Zoom and the room, and then her committee will meet briefly and discuss with Avery what needs to be done, et cetera, and whether or not she passed, which I have no doubt that she will, and go from there. Any questions regarding format, whatnot? We have coffee, we have bagels. Good. Thanks, Taylor, by the way. All right, let me open up in prayer, and then we can get things started. Dear Lord, thank you for this wonderful day. We thank you for the blessings that you provide and the guidance that you provided for Avery, who will be presenting her work. Bless her and guide her as she defends this thesis. We thank you for the help and support that her committee members and the faculty members, as well as her cohort peers, have provided for her in the last few months as she begins a new chapter in this journey in her career. Lord, you bless us every day. We thank you for your presence and make us more aware of that presence as we approach the Christmas season. We lift this prayer and all those prayers unsaid in your mighty name we pray. Amen. All right. So without further ado, here we've got her Canva up. Hook you up with the mic. We'll get to go.
Where should I put it?
Just check it
Here?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you guys so much for coming. I'm so excited to get to actually present this. It's been, like Dr. A said, a really long time coming. So I can walk around and not be leashed to the table. So the title of my study is Predicting Bat Speed with Energy Flow and Kinematic Variables in Collegiate T Batting. I started this study in 2019. I remember sitting in meetings, kind of deliberating what we were going to talk about. And we decided that the literature in hitting is very sparse. And we were so excited to kind of start pioneering the way for what that would look like, and kind of dig through what existed and where we wanted to go. And yeah, so without further ado, here I go. So I wanted to start by, full screen. Kind of defining some terms for you that I'm going to be throwing around just in case there's any questions or anything like that. So the first keyword here is kinematics. So these are your position terms. So you're talking about position and angles, and then once those are integrated, or you take the area under the curve, you're looking at velocity, and then the second derivative is an acceleration. So Those are kinematics, looking at velocities, accelerations, and position variables. Kinetics, we are looking at forces, torques, those are the rotational forces, ground reaction forces, those are the equal and opposite reactions that we place into the ground every day, every moment, every walk. And then impulses are changes in momentum. So momentum is mass times velocity, so it's changes over time in momentum. And then the kinetic chain, that's a big buzzword that we hear a lot about. I can do a quick Google search and give you all the bro science definitions of the kinetic chain. But it's defined as the culmination of energy from proximal to distal segments. So we're looking at how energy is transferred and built up through the subsequent segments of the kinetic chain, resulting in a velocity, whether that's ball speed, bat speed, tennis serve speed, velocity of the volleyball, whatever else. And then finally, energy flow. We're going to be talking a lot about how energy transfers, absorbs, and generates through the kinetic chain. So we'll go through some more calculations for those things in a minute. But just to start, those are our basic definitions. And then looking at a literature review. So this is kind of where I started. We started looking at where the literature was, like I said, and we noticed that there's a lot of obviously pitching kinematics. So this is a javelin study that was done, kind of looking at, it's more of a like, I would say benchmark study looking at counter movements, but it was helping to understand how the counter movements occur in the overhead throw. So obviously storing and releasing elastic energy in the throwing movement pattern. But if you watch a batter, you can see there's an obvious counter movement occurring where he's creating an eccentric stretch with his upper trunk and pelvis separating and decoupling, and then a quick amortization phase followed by a really fast acceleration of the upper trunk towards the batter. And so I kind of wanted to know more about what was happening in that counter movement and where the specific variables that can predict bat speed are. So I'll talk about why we chose bat speed as the predictor in a little bit. But just to give you a framework of where we're going, we started looking at counter movements and this little alien man doing a javelin throw. So the big thing that I kept seeing in the differences between the pitching kinematics or kinetics kinematics and hitting kinetics kinematics was the open versus closed chain. So on the left, obviously we see a pitcher and he's undergoing like when he reaches like ball release, which is the most important movement, he's in an open kinetic chain, meaning one leg is off the ground, not fixed in a closed chain of kinetic movement. Whereas in the swing, he's undergoing obviously closed chain with both feet on the ground. So this was a really big idea in my head, is like, okay, what's the difference between these two movements? It's like there's different torques that are experienced because both feet are fixed on the ground. So there's a study looking at the golf swing that understood there's a lot more torque occurring at the pelvis when he reaches full extension, as opposed to those that are occurring in the upper trunk or the upper shoulder. So again, just building a picture of where we're going, we're trying to build a more robust understanding of the swing because it's not as widely researched, and trying to pull apart the differences between these two movements. And then there we go. So I will break apart the phases of the hitting cycle just to kind of give you a better idea of what's happening in this movement. These were adapted from other studies that have been done in the past to kind of help us create phases and what's occurring in each phase and kind of differentiate between each one and what's happening. So the initial phase is the stance phase. That's where we're initiating weight transfer onto the back leg. And then the front foot is going to reach off or break contact with the ground. So during this phase, we'll also see an initiation of coiling away. It's kind of like beginning the loading phase, coiling away from the pitcher. When I say away, I'm like relating to the pitcher and towards the pitcher. And then in the stride phase, we'll see the front foot breaking contact all the way to the point it makes contact with the ground. In this phase, we're continuing to see the coiling away from the pitcher. And then this is what's going to like initiate that counter movement we've been talking about. So as we move to the drive phase, we'll see that, I should say lead foot, front foot, same thing, front foot contact to the ground to the maximum trunk rotation. So at this point, this is where we start seeing what's called the summation of speed principle. So this is where the pelvis is going to start to rotate towards the pitcher and the trunk is going to remain in a closed position. So we're seeing that decoupling of the trunk and the pelvis. And at this point, the summation of speed is where one segment needs to reach peak velocity before the subsequent segment can begin to rotate. So the pelvis has to reach its peak and then the trunk will start. So again, that decoupling, and then we see this eccentric stretch occurring between the two segments. And so moving to more important segments, I blew this up a little bit more for you so you can see better. That acceleration is where we'll see our performance indicator of ball impact. So the pelvis has already reached its peak and the trunk is going to begin rotating towards the pitcher until he reaches ball impact. And then also during this phase, you can see here a knee extension, which is another thing I noticed that was super interesting that I never really pictured before, because the swing is such a fast movement. There's only so much you can see when it's going so fast. But that was one thing I was really interested in, is how that affects the rest of the kinetic chain. And then finally, we'll reach swing finish. So this is where the hitter is most susceptible to injury, which is really interesting. So after follow through, after he makes contact with the ball, he's going to continue to rotate, and the bat is going to carry momentum all the way around, and all that energy has to go somewhere. So all of this torque from the complete rotation is going to be experienced in the pelvis and in the obliques as well. So that's where we see a lot of those oblique injuries occurring. There's actually in the last few years been an increase in the prevalence of oblique injury in baseball hitters. Interesting. So all of these data that I'm collecting, all this knowledge, that's what's happening. We're trying to figure out, okay, what is the best performance indicator here? So in baseball pitching, it's ball velocity, makes sense. But here there's so many variables that can contribute to the success of a hit. It could be, I don't know, timing or strength or ball path or bat path or the location of the pitch, so many things that it's not only in the control of the hitter. So because we're looking at summation of speed and different kinetic variables, we decided that bat speed would be the best variable to be the dependent variable of the study. And it's also been what is used throughout most of the literature as well. So several studies have kind of argued why this is the best performance indicator, including increased decision time, which gives the hitter a lot more time to see the pitch if they can swing the bat faster. Again, decreased swing time, those are inversely related to each other. It reduces the amount of time needed to complete the rotation, and it gives even more time to see the ball and make an informed decision on what you would like to do, swing the bat or not. So it also results in increased batted ball velocity. So that's where it makes it a lot more difficult for the defense to be able to react to it, and could go a lot farther. So this is our dependent variable for the research that the research questions I developed. So our first research question, I ended up splitting it into two complete different research questions because we're looking at both kinematics and kinetics, and they both required a different analysis and a different perspective on creating this robust picture of the swing. So the first research question was, which kinematic factors can best predict bat speed? So those are, again, our angles, velocities, accelerations of different segments of the body. So several studies that were done there was a handful of them, one from 1995, one from 2009, one from 2010, all that are pretty outdated at this point. And all of them were looking at kinematic factors and were able to give a really rounded understanding of what is occurring in the swing, but they were comparing to either youth populations or comparing to unskilled populations or injured populations, and just assuming which factors would be related to bat speed and not really able to show you the data of okay, this can predict bat speed. They would just assume, okay, this is due to the bat speed, due to the strength, due to the skill difference. So it wasn't really very clear on how it could be related to bat speed itself. So this was our first research question. I'm going to kind of pull you through what factors were most important in those studies. And then those were the factors that we looked at overall and then tried to find which ones could predict bat speed. So first one was stride knee angle and angular velocity. So that's kind of what I was talking about before. So this is how extended he gets and how fast he gets there in that like lead knee. So most of the research was looking at it as a bracing mechanism where it creates a stable base for the pelvis to and the trunk to rotate on. So it occurs mostly right before ball impact. So they'll like get fully extended right before and after, and that velocity peaks right before. So this is one of the variables we were looking at, and I was really excited to see how it related because it was across all of the literature that said this lead knee was going to be significantly different between populations of skilled and unskilled youth and adult, etc. We were also looking at the pelvic angle and the maximum pelvic angular velocity. So when I talk about pelvic angle, I mean in the transverse plane. It's where it is in space in relation to our lab when we did data collection. So this is looking at how fast he can get his pelvis to rotate in the transverse plane and also where it is at what point in time. So this is pointing to the summation of speed principle as well. The faster he can get his pelvis through that rotation, the faster the other segments are going to be able to rotate as well. So this study found that the lead or the peak angular velocity of the pelvis and the angles that it was at in specific points in time in the swing were statistically different between youth and adult populations. So I was excited to see this one too. We also looked at trunk angular velocity. This occurs later in the swing and is a part of the summation of speed principle, and is the summation of both the pelvis and the lower extremity rotating. So this was also statistically different between skilled and unskilled hitters. And it's just how fast he can get that trunk to rotate and where it is in space. So this is the maximum trunk angle that I wanted to focus on from the beginning. So I was excited about this one because it's been statistically significant in predicting several different sport performance indicators. So badminton, volleyball, golf club head speed, there was maybe not volleyball. There was like a lot of different like movement patterns that this was significant in. So this is defined as the peak loading angle of the lumbosacral joint. That's the joint between your sacrum and L5 in your lumbar spine. And it's the angle between that pelvis and upper trunk. So when they get fully extended in this rotation, it occurs like just after he puts his foot on the ground. So this is a significant variable that we've been looking at from the beginning. So I was excited to see how this related in our pool. And then finally, we're also looking at lead elbow extension angular velocity. So this was interesting because they argued that the faster elbow extension could display better use of summation of speed because they're not just pulling the bat with bent arms. But I think this is honestly, in my research, related more to skill, where athletes know how to pull the ball to opposite field or hit to same field and how fast they can get extended there. So I wasn't super sure about this one, but it came up as significantly different between these populations. So my hypothesis, based on that literature, was looking at specific points in the hitting cycle and those factors that occur there. So the three I was looking at, or four, are pelvic rotational velocity occurring in the drive phase. So that's where his foot is on the ground and he's beginning that rotation and going to reach the peak. So that peak pelvic rotational velocity through the drive phase. The X factor that I talked about as he reaches that peak loading angle, and then the angular velocity of the trunk that would follow that. And then also the stride knee extension velocity that occurs just before ball impact right there. So these are the variables that I was hypothesizing that would be predictors of bat speed. So shifting gears to the second research question, but not really because it's still in the same idea of building a robust picture. So now we're looking at which kinetic and calculated energy flow variables can predict bat speed. So reminder, these are your ground reaction forces, that force that you place into the ground, the equal and opposite reaction, as well as impulses that change in momentum, forces, and then torques, your rotational torques. So most of the literature that does exist on energy flow is surrounding walking. Those are the more benchmark studies, sprinting. And then also there's a lot of tennis and then pitching. So that's where the data is. And those are all more, like I said, benchmarks to kind of understand what energy flow is and then apply it to all these different movements, which is really cool. So these are our calculated energy flow variables. This is a lot on one page, so I'm going to break it down a little bit so we can understand. So we're starting with joint force power. So this is a calculated variable that relates to energy transfer by joint forces. So this is the force of the joint. How does this work? Force of the joint times the velocity of the joint. And this can be sometimes a little bit irrelevant just because it's more linear and no like segments will rotate at the same velocity unless you're doing like a hollow hold and you're going to rock back and forth and it's not going to really change in the velocities between the two joints that are attached, or the two segments that are attached at one joint, but it's still included for the net calculations. And then joint torque power is the rate of energy generation and absorption by the joint torques. So when we're looking at torques, it's talking about the rotational torque occurring at a joint, and it's generation and absorption. So generation, you're thinking concentric contraction. Absorption, you're thinking eccentric. So it's the decreasing angle and the increasing angle. And then segment torque power, you're looking at rate of energy transfer by the joint torque. So this is calculated looking at a joint and the angular velocity occurring at the proximal segment and the distal segment. So that will tell us which direction energy is transferring, whether it's proximally or distally, up or down the kinetic chain. And then segment powers is talking about rate of energy output or input from a segment. So how energy transfers from the pelvis into the trunk, etc. So that's where we're going. And then the data that does exist, we're looking at mostly the pitch and then the tennis serve as well. So the pitch studies have been both injury preventative, like looking at how at risk an athlete would be for injury to the elbow, or also ball velocity. So it's kind of both, which is really cool. A lot of these are Dr. A studies, which are really exciting. It was so cool to get to learn from him. So starting with, I'll start at the ground, which is a little bit more helpful. So they found that the ground reaction forces of this back leg, the drive leg and the pitch, are vertically, those are related to ball speed. And then in the lead leg, it's looking at the braking force. So this is going to be occurring earlier in the swing, usually in the pitch, usually in the stride phase. And this is occurring later in the arm cocking phase. So it's how this braking force is going to be stopping his linear momentum forward. And then in terms of energy transfer, we're looking at how the significant predictors of ball speed were transferred from the drive hip to the pelvis in that stride phase. So that's right here. So when he's pushing off the mound and like beginning to rotate toward home plate, it's how energy is transferring up the chain. So that's in the back leg. And then in the stride leg through the arm cocking phase, arm cocking is going to be the loading phase. Energy actually transferred down. So from the pelvis to the stride leg, which is kind of counter what all of the culture or the talk about the kinetic chain argues for, is everything goes up the chain, up the chain, up the chain. So now in this stride or the arm cocking phase, this loading phase, energy is transferring distally, which is really interesting because it's pointing to how important stabilization is in this movement. So the pelvis needs to be stabilized in order to be able to rotate all the way. And then also energy transfer and generation, that says form, it should say from the pelvis into the trunk during the arm cocking phase. So there's back to the up the chain. And then finally in the tennis serve, what was found was energy output from the trunk to the serving arm, again, up the chain, which is really cool. So all this is kind of arguing for the pelvis being the root segment and how energy kind of transfers from that. And so there is one study that exists on energy flow in the swing. However, it has been done in the entire hitting cycle. So it wasn't segmented into different phases. And it also didn't look at ground reaction forces and impulse specifically. It just was calculated into the energy flow variables. So based on what exists and based on the entire hitting cycle, what was found in this study was energy transfer into the pelvis from the hip joint. So It's kind of just through the entire segment. We don't really know where, or the hitting cycle, we don't really know where exactly, but it's transferring up the chain from both stride legs to the pelvis by the hip joint, and then energy transfer from the lumbosacral joint into the torso. So that's from pelvis to torso, and then energy absorption into the lumbosacral joint, which I thought was really cool because that's looking at your eccentric phase. Energy absorption is eccentric. And so that could be, we don't know where, again, it could be the rotation and the separation between the pelvis and the upper trunk in those oblique muscles, and maybe even the smaller muscles of the back that are attached at the L5S1 joint. So all this is kind of just a little bit vague. So I was really excited to get to dive deeper based on this understanding. And it's kind of pointing to the torso as energy flow transfer pathway. So it doesn't really argue that it's a generator of energy flow or energy at all or power at all. It's just saying it's a pathway for transfer, which I thought was really interesting because a lot of the literature shows that the trunk is producing energy. So anyway, we're going to see how it does transfer. So this hypothesis, big picture, I was hypothesizing that we would see a similar shear-ish force occurring in the like ground reaction forces and impulses. So we were going to see that vertical back leg ground reaction force impulse that we saw in the pitch, and then that back hip transfer to the pelvis to that earlier stride phase where we're pushing into that stride. And then through the drive phase, I was hypothesizing that we would see that braking impulse that was found in the pitch, and then that lead hip transfer from the pelvis to the trunk, because that's what was found in the Horiuchi study that was looking at energy flow. And then finally looking at transfer to the trunk and also absorption through that L5S1. I just was really excited to see where. I was hypothesizing it was going to happen probably just before this moment right here. So that's why I put it right there, because I didn't fit it right here. So it'd probably be that absorption would be here and the transfer kind of would be in this location. So I was really excited to see what was going to happen. But kind of big picture hypothesis, we're saying kinematics, kinetics will predict bat speed. So I was going to argue for stride knee angular velocity, pelvic angular velocity and angle, X factor and trunk angular velocity will predict bat speed, as well as the kinematic and energy flow variables I just broke down for you, saying that everything is going to go up the chain with what the literature has argued for. But that question was still in my head of Dr. A's study of like, is it going to go down? I really don't know. So I was excited to get to look at it and see where it was going to go. Going into methods. So we had 9 collegiate position players between the ages of 18 to 24 volunteer for this study. We ran a G-power analysis that said we only needed a sample size of 6, which was great because I was going to get as many as I could, and 9 guys volunteered. We had IRB protection and they all signed informed consent when they came to the lab. Data collection involves the 8-camera 3D motion capture system. He's kind of standing in front of our camera, but there's one right there. There's 8 cameras stationed around the room that are interfaced with Cortex that collect at a frame rate of 240 Hertz. And then he's standing on our 2 force plates that are going to collect our ground reaction force and impulse data, collecting at 1800 Hertz. And then for bat speed, we used the blast motion sensor, which Dr. A did a validation study on and found that it was able to detect bat speed up to 94% with a 6 plus or minus 2% error. And then we used 39 reflective body markers. So they're placed in medial and lateral locations about his joints to be able to calculate joint centers when we do our analysis. And then there's 7 markers on the bat. It's not in this picture, but there are 7 markers on the bat. So we chose to do data collection in the lab. There's Tina, a little cameo. We chose to do our data collection in the lab because it's a more controlled setting. We're able to use the force plates for the energy flow calculations. And then it's also a little bit more, like I said, more controlled, just so we can get a better idea of the swing itself rather than anything involving timing and reaction, location of the pitch and things like that, just to get and understand the swing itself. But we do lose the game-like scenario, which is a bummer. The Horiuchi study did do toss batting, but they used a sponge ball, which I thought was interesting because then you're almost analyzing a dry swing instead of contact swing. And it could change the mechanisms that are occurring there. So we do lose the game-like scenario. It is a little bit uncomfortable because they're all taped up. They're not wearing their cleats. Maybe the friction could be a little bit different, but we are trying to understand the swing itself and not the extraneous variables that are occurring. And then here's a little picture of what it looked like when we did our data collection. We had them swing about 8 to 10 trials after a quick warm up where they were able to take as much time as they needed to feel comfortable swinging without their shirt on. And then Tina's head is just in front of the tee right there, but they were swinging off the tee. And then we kept 4 captures, the ones that were able to be correlated with from the blast sensor and the motion capture. So our statistical research design, so for each question, like I said, we had to come at them from different perspectives. So we ran a mixed linear model regression for the kinematic data. And this was basically, we were originally going to use a stepwise regression, but we wanted to use all of the samples that we took. So instead of just using the fastest one, we used all of the data. This model takes into account the non-dependent structure that you get when you do use all of the trials. So we're looking at between and within subject variance, and that's why we chose this model. So first we ran a random intercept regression where you're looking at how each participant deviates from the average mean of bat speed. And then after that, we ran a likelihood ratio at alpha level of 0.05 to be able to understand how each player would deviate from each. That's for the random intercept, but for the likelihood ratio, which model can create the best picture of the predictors. So how this group would be predictive of bat speed better than ones without. And then for the energy flow, we used at least absolute shrinkage and selection operator regression, elasto regression. This was modeled after Dr. A's study where when we did energy flow, it's used because we're looking at a high dimension model where we have more variables than we do sample size. And so what it does is it takes all of the variables that are irrelevant and it shrinks them, penalizes them to 0. And so because we're trying to reduce the number of variables that we're looking at to create the best picture of which ones can predict bat speed, this model was appropriate to use. Now, getting into our results, I'm really excited. We're going to go starting kinematic, answering the first question of which ones can best predict bat speed, which kinematic variables can predict bat speed, and then we'll move to energy flow. So front knee extension angle and velocity were both significant predictors of bat speed. So this is saying, this graph right here is the knee flexion angle. It's actually flipped. Negative is more flexed, positive is more extended. Obviously, we're not going to get really that far over 0 or else we're getting into some crazy hyperextension. But this first line right here is the point at which the player is in the separation angle, so max trunk rotation. The second line is ball impact. So this is kind of highlighting our bat acceleration phase right here. And then just before is more like the stride and drive. So what this is saying is as he's moving through approaching max trunk rotation, he's going to begin extending. And then over here, we have our velocity. So just through this drive phase is where he reaches that peak extension velocity and then reaches the peak just after impact, which I thought was great, super interesting. They were both predictive of bat speed. They reached an average about 12 degrees of flexion. That's pretty extended. And then 205 degrees per second of velocity. And then pelvis angular displacement and pelvis angular velocity were both significant. angle at front foot contact, which I was pretty stoked about. That was really interesting because that's where they put their front foot down and begin rotating. So that point at which their foot is down and they're already in this rotated stance approaching maximum trunk rotation was significant to predict bat speed. It's a variable, it's related, it's in reference to the lab itself. So it's a number that doesn't really make a lot of sense when it's out of context of the lab, but maximum pelvic angular velocity was about 624 degrees per second of those p-values. And then X factor was also significant, which I was excited about. This is looking at the trunk angle in general, not just in the maximum trunk rotation. So this is where he reaches like the peak like rotation, and then the peak separation between the trunk and the pelvis is right there. And then he'll rotate towards the pitcher until reaching ball impact. They reached about 32.8 degrees of separation between those two segments, and it was significant to predicting bat speed with a p-value of 0.043. And then this is basically summary. This is what we found in terms of significance. Max trunk angular rotation, max pelvic velocity, pelvic angle at front foot contact, strident angle at ball impact, and maximum strident extension angular velocity. So it's a lot of loading variables, which I thought was interesting. And then these two, there are 3 velocity points. So this is kind of beyond the scope of the study, but I thought it was really helpful to get a picture of what the other data says. So the variables that weren't significant were lead elbow extension velocity and trunk angular velocity. So the black line is the present study. The white line and the blue line and the green line are several other studies that were also looking at kinematics. It's kind of like a mini meta-analysis without any stats, so it's not really one, but just looking at, in general, what the numbers look like. So these are all the same population of experienced hitters. But the interesting thing here, we see the trunk rotation velocity was much lower than the norm. Some of these studies didn't do all of the variables that we ran. Like the green study didn't look at trunk rotation, but in the trend, these two are pretty high and ours is pretty low. So subsequently, the lead elbow extension velocity was extremely high. It's not like too far off of these two, but in the general trend, it was pretty far off. So I was trying to explain this and understand it in my head and found a lot of studies that argued for this catch-up mechanism that occurs, where you kind of lose a lot of kinetic energy at the torso, maybe due to lack of abdominal strength, lack of range of motion, whatever else. And then the following segment has to catch up and produce a lot more torque, a lot more velocity to be able to reach the velocity that we want to be reaching. So that's just in reference what the different bat speeds looked like. But I thought this was really interesting for our pool of data. The other thing that I was thinking, we have a lot of younger athletes that were in our data set. So several of them were freshmen that were a little bit newer to the program that didn't really have the experience that the other ones did. And could have maybe thrown the data off a little bit. And then when looking at the sequencing, when I was looking at the skeletal, it's kind of easier to see where the errors are when you're looking at a skeleton. So a lot of them were reaching maximum trunk rotation before they put their foot down. So they're getting their loading before they even put their foot down. So it's not really possible to get full separation. And then this is what it is actually supposed to look like, where they're reaching maximum trunk rotation after they put their foot down on the ground. So this could be a reason why they didn't have the trunk velocity as a significant predictor, but I thought it was interesting. Now, this is what our data collection looked like. I'll slow them down a little bit so you can see better, but this is what it looks like after processing. We're about to get into the energy flow variables, if this will let me. I just want you to see.
Like the line is above the line.
I know. Oh, it skipped way back. Okay. So green means that energy is leaving the segment. Red means it is entering the segment. So if I pause it, oh, I'm not going to put that. Okay. I'll show better pictures here. So this is what our data collection looks like. Oh, that's a good picture. His head kind of falls off. But this is a good picture of what we're looking at. This is the data that we extract, put it into the visual 3D analysis, and then build these skeletons that we can analyze for how energy is flowing through their body. So now we're going to shift gears, move to energy flow. So I stared at these graphs for hours, and I'm so excited to share with you what we found. So the little blurbs on the side were the significant predictors of bat speed. Now we're going to start with the blue line. So the most left graph, the blue one, is looking at stride pelvis transfer. So positive means distal, negative means proximal. So the distal segment to the pelvis is the stride leg. So energy is flowing distally. It's going down the kinetic chain. And this was a significant predictor of bat speed. So if we look at this initial little peak right here, I thought that one was interesting. That's at the point probably where we're reaching peak pelvic velocity, because this is the max trunk rotation. This is also through the entire hitting cycle. This is just a picture of what is occurring. So this is probably peak pelvic velocity, and then the pelvis is just remaining in this extended position, and it reaches peak transfer at just before ball contact, which I was like, that's crazy to think about. This is basically, it's not a whole lot of movement, but it's holding stability for the upper trunk to rotate on. So if we look down at this green graph right here, this is looking at energy generation and absorption, joint torque power. So at the point where energy is transferring the most, it's generating. So we're getting like energy generation all through this like acceleration phase from the lower extremity. So it's not just like turning off and turning on, turning off, turning on as it goes up. It's actually generating throughout the entire movement, which I thought was so incredible to think about how even as we begin to rotate, the energy generation absorption peak occurs just after like max trunk rotation. It's like building and building, and then it reaches the max. I'll get back to the this part in a second. But moving to the back pelvis, it's like front and back pelvis, lead and back. It says stride because this was the baseball pitch analysis, but it should be lead or front. So the back pelvis was not significant in predicting bat speed, but it did show a similar trend where energy was flowing distally, which I thought was crazy. So on both sides of the pelvis, energy is transferring down. And we see the same trend with the energy generation down here. So we're thinking about both extension torques that are occurring, because if you're moving into throwing your pelvis into rotation, there's an extension that occurs, or a external rotation that occurs on the lead side, and an internal rotation that has to happen on the back side. Then you also get a little bit of adduction, abduction as well. So all of those like lower extremity muscles that are attached at the pelvis have to be firing to keep that in like pelvis into rotation. So, and those were the significant pieces, which I was like, that's so cool. Now even crazier, we're looking at lumbosacral joint. So this over here. So again, distal is positive, proximal is negative. So at the lumbosacral joint, the proximal segment is the pelvis. So energy is transferring down from the lumbosacral joint as well. So this whole up the chain thing isn't even real in the swing. It's all going down, which is so exciting because we even looked at variables of the shoulders, and none of those were significant predictors of bat speed. It was all energy flow going down the pelvis. So the significant predictor of bat speed was the lumbosacral joint transfer through the acceleration phase, which was correct with the hypothesis. But as we get down here, we're looking at lumbosacral absorption as well. So because it's going down, and because the lumbosacral is absorbing it, we have to think of eccentric contractions, and it's going down. So it has to be any of the gluteal musculature, any of the like intrinsic muscles of the pelvis that have to be like eccentrically firing to stabilize the pelvis, probably not to throw it into any more rotation because it's occurring after the pelvis has already reached its peak. So it has to be stabilizing. So everything is having to come from this pelvis root segment, being able to hold the pelvis as the upper trunk and bat are rotating. And it's this insane amount of velocity and momentum that has to be controlled, and it has to be controlled by something, which is the pelvis. So I was so excited about that. It was so crazy because it was so counter to everything that was argued in the Horiuchi study, in the pitching analysis, and all these things. So it was just so interesting to see that it was so different. Oh, I forgot to go back. So the other interesting part was this stride lead absorption through the swing finish. So when we move through, as I mentioned when I was explaining the phases, the swing finish the momentum from the bat has to be carried somewhere. There's so much momentum that's occurring right here. So it has to be brought somewhere. And so it's absorbed into that stride hip, even the back one as well. You can see they're both absorbing here. And then we get this little peak in the lumbosacral transfer. So all that energy is kind of thrown down into the pelvis in order to kind of control the deceleration and even be able to, there's like a little generation here too, which is like the upper trunk has to be able to kind of contract to be able to control that motion, which that was cool too. So basically, in summary of the pelvis transfer through the acceleration phase, energy, this is just a zoomed in picture. The green again means energy is leaving. The red is energy is entering. So energy is leaving the trunk, entering the pelvis, and then entering both the stride and drive legs. This occurs a little bit earlier than this moment, but it's leaving the pelvis, entering the trunk, entering the lead hip, and going down the chain. So when we're thinking more of like practically, like what does this mean? A lot of studies have been done looking at which strength and conditioning variables are significant and which training modules were the most able to see a difference in VAT speed. It was a lot of like ballistic plyometric training, throwing med ball this way, throwing med ball this way, which was significant in predicting, or a significant difference between groups that controlled for that and didn't. But it was all attributing it to the concentric acceleration that's being trained. But I'm starting to think maybe it was just a training of the stabilization and a training of the eccentric contraction that's occurring there. That was what was able to see a difference in that. So kind of in summary of the whole analysis here, what we did see that I thought was interesting with the shear forces that were occurring between propulsive and back leg vertical impulse. It wasn't a braking impulse, it was a propulsive impulse. But I was like, where is that coming from? Because there is a braking force that has to occur to kind of slow down the linear momentum forward, but it must be an anterior posterior propulsive force to throw the pelvis into that rotation. So the propulsive braking is going to be the area under the negative curve for ground reaction force, and then propulsive is going to be the area under the positive curve. So it has to be going propulsive in the positive direction. So he's throwing his pelvis into rotation, and it's the momentum that is generated from that movement, which I was like, that's cool too, because I was expecting it to be the braking force, but it's actually the propulsive force to throw him into rotation. So that was shear force. We're also looking at, again, stride hip total transfer that's occurring here, lumbosacral absorption, lumbosacral transfer, stride hip absorption in the swing finish. So this is just in summary of everything we found in the energy flow. Kind of from here, I would love to talk about where the research could go. I'm really excited that Joshua is thinking about taking this on and kind of pushing this forward. I think it would be really interesting to see how this relates in a bigger sample size and how it would relate to different populations. So similarly to the other kinematic studies that were looking at how kinematic variables can predict bat speed between, or they're just looking at the difference between populations, it'd be cool to see how they predict bat speed looking at youth and adult, or skilled and unskilled, or injured and uninjured. It would be really interesting to see how energy transfer is different in those populations. It'd also be cool to do a more updated surface EMG analysis to see, looking at phasing, to understand which phases of the swing, which muscles are firing during those phases. It was done in maybe 2013 and did find that the lower extremity and the oblique musculature were fired mostly throughout the entire hitting cycle, and the shoulder wasn't activated at all, which I'm like, that's cool. So that would be interesting to see a more updated surface EMG study. Kind of some limitations that I found kind of as we were going through. I think the college age is really tough to be able to analyze just because, like we mentioned with the kinematic sequencing, you're getting kids that are 18 and straight out of high school compared to kids that are 24 and been lifting for forever. This is my husband, Travis. So he started, this is a picture from 2017 or 18, and this is from 2020. So if you look at where his pelvis is in relation, these bats are in almost the same location, just at ball impact. His pelvis is rotated so much more than it is here. And so it's just interesting to think, okay, these kids are like completely different developmentally and strength wise. So it's kind of tough to like create a population for college age, although experience level is a little bit higher. I also lost some participants, which was a bummer because I originally started this study in 2019 and 2020, and we did it with a different marker set. And this, when I came back to collect more data, there's a more updated marker set that made more sense to use for this study. And we ended up having to lose the data that I collected before, but it was more accurate and it made more sense for this study. And it collected a little bit different data. So I kind of had to throw out the old participants, which was a bummer. The other thing is it's indoors. Like we mentioned before, you kind of just lose the game-like scenario. The swing is a little bit different. It would be really nice if we could do like outdoor study with this and have it on the mound, do live ABs, but it doesn't really make sense because you could smash a camera. No, but we don't want to play that game. So that's kind of it. I have lists of references and more like regression pictures and things like that that we could talk through if you wanted to, but I didn't think it made sense. I just talked for a long time. So that's all. Thank you guys so much for coming.
I've got a few comments and questions, but we'll save that for the deliberation.
Okay.
For discussion. I do want to open up by saying that what Avery has conducted in his thesis, I mean, this is PhD level stuff. I mean, to be able to not only perform and understand the level of complexity in both the energy flow, the mixed regression, the mixed effects regression, as well as the last one, this is high quality stuff. So I mean, not to be commended for.
Thanks.
I mean, I helped you out. We all helped you out, but it's really you. I mean, you did the work, you did the legwork, and you're not just regurgitating information. You're actually synthesizing knowledge that's based on your analysis. Which, again, I hope that perhaps you and your next pathway in your career can continue this research.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, I know that's what you're doing for his thesis, but
Yeah.
You're addressing a few research questions that have been, looming in the literature for a while.
Yeah.
So, kudos for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have to run really quick, but I wanted to say, Avery, that I'm just so impressed and proud of you for this, especially because, I got to see you at your honors scholar presentation. I know that was over Zoom.
Yeah.
Just kind of got COVID. But just the progress that you've made between then and now, and your understanding of these concepts, and I feel like I just took biomechanics 101. Like 1001. It was high level. I learned a bunch from this, and to see you making these connections between different studies that were actually contradictory to your findings, but then making sense of it in a way that my brain was starting to think, oh, like, I wonder if this, and then you said exactly what the next thought was. And so just to see that coming from one of our students was just really, really cool. So I actually don't really have any questions. I do have some thoughts about practical applications of this
Totally.
going forward, and I think I'm glad Josh is going to continue it, but I just wanted to say good job.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I could cry. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, so I've got about 1,000 questions, but the one that stuck out to me the most was you referenced it again and again, and that was the Koruchi study. I've looked at it too. And, the fact that they didn't look at GRF or impulse, I think, was a huge lacking on their part, because as you and I both know, many of us here geometry and impulse are predictors and
Right.
the energy that a battery can generate, which is essential to understand
Totally.
energy flow. So my question to you is, I know you said that your limitation was that it was indoors, but I would argue that that's actually a positive influence of the study.
Totally.
Because using, dry swing over, with the sponge ball, it's basically a dry swing.
Right.
You're 100% right on that fact. So my question is, if you were to have redone it, would you, instead of a live at bat, would you have chosen maybe like a pitching machine? Would you have chosen something that wasn't, T-ball hitting? What would you have changed there?
I was thinking about that the other day. I think because we had the net, it made it a lot safer. I wouldn't have brought it outdoors just because you're right, you lose the like ground reaction force impulse, and the mobile ground reaction force plates that we have are like on stilts, so that would be really unsafe.
Yeah.
So I would say if I could do it again, I would love to maybe compare and see like doing a toss batting and like you kind of stand on the side and toss it so they can hit into the net.
Yeah.
That would be interesting to get a little bit more of the timing. I don't think I would really do a pitching machine in this situation just because it's a little bit dangerous for our really expensive system.
Yeah.
So if I was to do it again, maybe the toss batting, but with a real ball, not a sponge ball.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
I have a similar follow-up question. I'll just say I saw Dr. Samansky's lab just created a pitching mound with horse platform. So I would challenge Dr. Aguinaldo to create a batting
Yes.
space.
That would be
with
so
platforms
cool.
that you could, put people in and then actually do
Yeah.
pitching too. But my question is on that max trunk velocity differences that you saw. Do you attribute it to this area, attribute it to the fact that it was on a tee versus, so basically what you're having is a change in movement patterning.
Right.
Where there's no you don't have to predict.
Right.
Or try to guess, so they can just fully load up and lay out on the
Totally.
ball versus having to use this predictive analytics mentally and use that as part of their swing mechanics. So do you think that maybe had an effect on why you saw some differences in your results?
Totally. It would make a lot more sense if we could do it with fully loaded wham kind of thing. But yes, I would say that definitely would be a factor. And
I think that would be another good comparative
yes,
study, right? Because then if you could define where the differences in studies are coming from, now we've got a clear
Right.
picture of what's going on.
Right.
Kinetically and kinematically.
totally.
To be fair, the studies that she cited, I think all of them were either T or toss.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, well, maybe it is just the toss then.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the toss just adds that little layer of
They still,
difference.
that little reaction time.
Right. Because this is like, that would be more reactive. So it would be a lot faster. Whereas hitting off a tee is more ready, go.
Yeah.
Okay.
All
So
right, so now I'm gonna ask a question that is more related to my area.
yes.
And that has to do with the practical applicability. And you started to talk about it, but I want you to take it one step further. What you said is maybe what has been done and what is wrong. And I totally agree with you. I was a baseball strength coach, and I think at the time we were kind of doing some things using biometrics, using med balls. Now looking at the results of your study, what's your recommendation? Give me
Yeah.
an exercise or two that you think would help in the optimization of mechanics and reduce injuries in this population.
Totally.
Based on the findings of your study.
Right. So I would say, because a lot of the injuries that are occurring, you're talking about injury prevention, is oblique injuries, which is interesting. And I would say it's probably attributed to a lack of pelvis, like, or gluteal, maybe like intrinsics, maybe TFL and things like that. So I would say it would be not like just rotational. I mean, like that's a really great plyometric addition, but the strength, the lower body strength and power would have to be like priority A of the like getting your triple extension, because this is all an extension torque that's occurring. Like I could just do this and feel one of my glutes just firing up. So I would say maybe like I've seen Eric do it before, which I think is really cool, where they're kneeling and they'll do like med ball backwards. I don't know what that one's called. Do you know what it's called? I don't know. Overhead back throw, where you have to get, you're like,
Backward slam?
yeah, you're like,
Yeah, basically like a meatball.
yeah,
Kneeling ball.
kneeling because you're taking the like reducing it coming from your lower extremity and just coming from your gluteals. I would say that, and then also like there's a hitter's throw with the med ball. That would be really important. But
On the hitter's throw, what's the piece that's missing related to your findings that I think nobody's probably doing right now?
yeah, it's just like the pelvis stabilization, because when you're
Okay, so either pelvis stabilization or eccentric component
yeah,
to a med ball throw. So everything in strength and conditioning is release, right? So
Totally.
release throws. So I think there needs to be a secondary focus on the eccentric elements and a non-release throw. So
yeah,
a rotation with an eccentric stop. to
whoa,
heighten that activation and
That's
heighten
great.
eccentric development, I think would be really
Yeah.
important. And fits exactly with the model that you're saying.
Which
Totally.
makes sense, Dr. Oliver, because they have their back, right? And even after they hit the ball, they finish the entire swing with the back. They don't drop it later. So maybe some kind of med ball, and they're decelerating. You took home the message that it's all about deceleration after
Right.
ball impact. And perhaps those, I'm looking at the strength coaches here, eccentric training in that kind of type of pattern.
There's some cool new med balls out, like on ropes, so you can have the rope and you swing it through and then don't actually have to do the catch.
yeah,
Bring it. So anyway, I just think that there's some really good practical information that could come out of this study based on your findings that directly transfer it to coaching.
totally, which is cool.
I just want to say, first off, this is a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thoroughly enjoyed it, enjoyed the pictures. You really did a great job, just step by step, taking us through, understanding where you came from, how you kind of got through this research process, and then how you kind of interpreted the results. So I just want to say thanks for putting in that time and effort. This got me really excited.
Yay.
I had a question for you, kind of related to, and you touched on this a couple times, but this idea of, okay, there's a lot going on at the pelvis. It ideally is transferring up the trunk, but we've got shoulders and arms and hands that have to hold on to a bat,
Mhm.
and that bat's gonna have to come around.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought you suggested that you didn't really see a whole lot of energy, like generation or transfer in the upper extremities.
Yeah.
So are the arms, on one hand, are they just kind of along for the ride? But on the other hand, you talked about elbow, and we're seeing pictures of, lead elbow flexion and leading to extension. So like you're holding on to a mat, you've got to have strength to do that.
Right.
There's flexion, there's extension. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk through what you saw a little bit more about the upper extremity, because in my mind, yes, as we had this awesome discussion with Dr. Alvar, training, kind of pelvis, X factor, but do we not need to train the arms and the shoulders?
It's a good question. Very good question. I think, because what we saw was that just none of it was significant in predicting bat speed. Not to say it's not significant. You do have to be able to hold on to that bat. And a lot of the guys like to do like grip strength and like to really work on their ability to hold on to that bat. But what it ends up being is a lot of like tension force. So this is like a centripetal acceleration. So when you're doing this, this is like the force that's holding onto the bat is tension. So you're like pulling on the bat and just being able to hold on to it. And then it's momentum that's kind of just carrying you through. So I wouldn't say like, no, just throw out upper body strength, but it's that extension velocity that is like important. But I would have to do more research and more understanding to know like how it is relevant, like what it is correlated to, what's important. Is it upper body power? Is it upper body? I don't know. That's a really good question that we'd have to do a lot more research in to understand. But that's a good question. Definitely to start looking at upper body. It's kind of sparse, surprisingly, is upper body kinematics. and kinetics in the swing. What I have seen, there's this idea called the serape effect, which I had never heard of before this study, where it's muscle activation from like upper shoulders and then like trunk. So it kind of like crosses like this from your obliques. And I don't know that it's super true, because at least in this movement pattern, because the oblique activation is intense, like it's over 100% throughout the entire movement, but shoulder activation is like 28% of your MBIC. So it's just like super low, which is crazy, because I would think that it would be you have to pull this bat to get through, but it's not much pulling, it's just hanging on the tension, you know?
I mean, you said arms are along for the ride. I mean, we see that picture. So this I think is more of a result of what's happened prior to in the kinetic chain. And the rest of it's kind of guided. So I'm just telling you from a perspective as an analyst for pitching, baseball pitching, and I think that would equate to what we see hitting. But that's something that potentially Josh can look into.
Yeah, Josh.
It might actually get to the differentiation between a good and elite hitter, though.
Yeah.
So if you
Totally.
move from a good hitter to an elite hitter, I think having that upper body strength and your ability to move the bat faster based on some upper body mechanics and wrist and forearm speed would move you up in your capabilities. But again, I've only seen that like, and your ability to drive through the ball, have no loss in bat speed through contact. Those types of things, I think, move you from like a college player to a professional player.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
I mean, you see these elite players, they've got exit velocities of about 105, 107 miles per hour. You know, Manny Machado and Corey Seager, and all of his core, right? But yeah, maybe there's something in terms of the guidance that the arms provide and how much that summates and contributes ultimately to the dance.
Cool.
Yuki?
Thank you so much for presenting
Yeah.
this research. I could see where should I go to in my research, because this is a good example. I know that this Dr. A said this is PhD level, but, but this is good an example. So my question, maybe this is off topic because you are focusing on more batting, but you touch the kind of energy flow of pitching.
Mm-hmm.
So does there is a variety of pitching from overhead or side-handed or the lower-handed.
Yeah.
So does a variety of different pitching form affect the energy flow? Because usually overhead pitcher slow pass the ball than a side-handed or lower-handed.
Yeah.
It's kind of similar to batting and throw.
Yeah.
It's kind of different, more trunk flexion, but same swing.
Totally.
So that's why I'm
Yeah.
curious,
That's a good question.
side-handed pitcher or lower-handed pitcher
Mhm.
using more energy flow or
Yeah.
velocity or something.
I don't know if I can speak a ton for pitching, but for batting, there's a study that was done looking at high T and low T setting, and the energy flow of the upper extremity was more intense for the lower T setting. So it would be interesting to see what that looks like in the pitch, where it's like a 3/4 pitch or wherever it is, how it would change the mechanics. I really don't know. I haven't looked at all that data, but I do know in the swing it is different. Because a high T, you're kind of here as opposed to being a lower T position. So definitely is different activation of the upper extremity. Wow. I mean, it'd be cool to look at. I don't know in the pitch. I'm sure there's stuff out there, but I haven't focused on it. But it'd be interesting to see. Yeah. Anything else?
Questions, comments?
Thank you guys so much for coming.
Awesome.
That's so sweet.
Grab your mic. So this is what we're gonna do. Those of you who are online, we are going to dismiss you. We have to leave the room because the room is needed. So we'll congregate over in the Kines lobby. Dr. Nalvar and I will meet. You want to meet in your office? Yeah, we'll just go in your office and then we'll call you back in a few minutes, okay? Thank you, Zoomies, for joining us. Shout out to Avery.
Got the